Welcome to Under the Hive of Madness. I am Ryan the Goblin King, and today I am joined by Marky.
Hey, what's going on, everybody?
Beast.
Hey, everyone.
And we are graced with the immaculate presence of the God Emperor Kevin.
Hello.
On this episode, we're going to take a couple of steps back and look at a brief history of the entirety of the 40k timeline.
So strap in, baby.
Everything. First to last.
Right. So this is probably going to be our first two-part episode, just to let you guys kind of get an idea of where we're headed. We're going to start with how we got to, or no, we're not going to start with. We're going to start in prehistory, and we're going to work our way through to where the lore is as far as 9th edition of 40k is concerned. We're going to try to touch a little bit briefly on how the lore has changed with each edition, and how that can help establish a baseline for how you guys can get into the hobby. As we've talked about in the past, what is canon in lore and what is common knowledge in lore aren't always necessarily the same thing, so you'll definitely hear some of our thoughts on how that works. Kevin, I know a good chunk of your early time and introduction to the hobby came mostly from that lore side, pretty much from books that existed in the Black Library publications.
Yeah, I started with Gaunt's Ghosts and Eisenhorn Ravener. I picked up all of those in one trip to Barnes & Noble. I just kind of was like, all right, this one, and this one.
That's a pretty big.
Get all the. Oh yeah, it was a fat stack.
Oh yeah,
but it was so great.
Huge.
Oh yeah, it was the omnibus, so they're like 3 or 4 inches a piece.
Fatties.
Dude, 6 books
Oh my god,
it was gnarly. And I just deep dived, plowed through them, just all of them like one after another, back to back to back.
Yeah, that's more than I read in school, man.
It was it was in school. I read more Warhammer than I did actual textbooks or anything.
Oh yeah, right.
Like it was dumb.
Yeah, like I just made my girlfriend she read the book, and then I was like, "What's the answer to the test?" She's like, "Rockhammer." I'm like, "All right, gotcha."
All right, gotcha.
Purple Monkey dishwasher.
And then so from there, and then that's when Dawn of War came out, and then that's when because this is all like before there was any lore channels. Like nobody had a YouTube channel where they broke this down. Like it was. This is in early,
or if they did, it was trash.
Oh yeah, like
no offense to anybody that started.
Like
out.
honestly, I don't think because that was like the birth of YouTube. So there wasn't.
Oh yeah, totally.
Because like I went to I mean, I learned about it in middle school, and then I started really getting the books in high school.
I mean, MTV still played music videos, and radios still were radios. So.
Right.
Yeah.
Like you had a cassette tape. Be Kind, Rewind. Like it was old.
That was pretty cool.
B-side.
It definitely opens up, and that's a lot of that canon conversation that we did talk about in our first episode, where like what the canon lore is and what the lore as far as the bag is.
About canon?
Oh yeah, and like
I'm gonna shove you into the canon and shoot you out.
Let me tell you.
So like Dan Abnett was one of the original writers, and he's the author who wrote those books. So he was actually, I remember reading a little excerpt, and it was like. It was one of his kind of jobs to flesh out a lot of the details that weren't known about specifically like Imperial Guard. So he was like, I think he was the one who coined the term Voxcaster for their radio.
Oh, okay.
Pretty cool.
He was the first one to kind of like implement it because nobody had written that book yet. So it kind of fell on him. So like I got a lot of those cool like early exposure to like in the early set of the lore.
Cool. We actually have some quick clarifications. I made a mistake just kind of talking about some of the Eldari lore. I mentioned that the War in Heaven was an event between the Necron-Tyr and the Eldari. That isn't 100% correct. The War in Heaven was actually between the Necron-Tyr and the Old Ones.
Yeah, the Eldar were just a part of it. Created so they could help fight.
Yeah. The Old Ones come up a lot in a lot of the like kind of ancient lore tidbits that G-Dub drops. They're kind of like a mythological forerunner race. With the reemergence of the Necron-specific lore, they're being woven a lot more directly into things. They're actually really revealing a lot more about the Old Ones. It's speculated in the universe that the Old Ones seeded most of the galaxy with life. Mark just mentioned they specifically created the Eldari and the Kork, which are forerunners of the Orcs, the Kork, to fight against as like living weapons against the Necron-Tyr. The Old Ones didn't really lose; they just kind of went away. And the Necron-Tyr obviously went through, they died out in the biotransference and became what we know as the Necrons today. And at that point, the Eldari inherited the Webway, as well as the remnants of that Old One empire, and kind of became the stewards and rose to prominence.
And the Orcs devolved into the the Krorks devolved into the orcs, and
right, they lost
Eldar
their
went
like
away.
super technology. The Eldar did that orgy. And
Necron went sleepy. Bye bye.
Yeah, Necrons went into forever sleep.
Dude, tell me about it. I'm tired.
Yeah. So that's actually one of the big things, as we talk about lore, and we'll continue to get into it throughout this episode. But, Games Workshop's lore has evolved over time. The biggest one in recent memory is the Necron. The Necron lore has gone through a pretty big retcon.
Yeah, just because of like the 9th Codex or
and
the revamp, basically.
One of the things that it kind of, I play a lot of Total Warhammer on PC, which is the fantasy Total War, kind of like Rome and medieval. But in that they have the Tomb Kings, and it seemed like when they rewrote a lot of the Necron lore, they borrowed a lot of their original inspiration from the fantasy. And like how I had mentioned at some point also that Karl Franz and Gilliman have a lot of parallels.
Right. Yeah.
The Necron parallel straight to the Tomb Kings.
Oh, that's dope.
And there's like different dynasties of Tomb Kings, and they applied that kind of like GW transfer stamp art over here onto the Necrons.
Yeah.
Started
recycled bits.
Yeah. So it's kind of interesting that you mentioned that, because the old ones in Warhammer Fantasy Battle are the Slann, and the Slann are part of the lizard folk. Right. So there was a time, and this is like second or third edition, where the Warhammer Fantasy Battle world existed in the Warhammer 40k world. That is no longer true. That's been retconned out,
which saddens me. I would have really loved if that was the case.
When I got into Warhammer, that was what I knew. And it's funny because I screamed it. I said it to myself a second ago. I knew it. When you said the old ones, I was going to jump in and be like, lizard people.
Yep. The Slann, dude.
It's really funny. Yeah.
Are they descendants, or are they just a worshiper of the Slann?
They're just kind of a worshiper of the Slann. The Slann the Slann occupy that kind of like quasi old one in Warhammer Fantasy Battle. That they're essentially the old ones is to 40k. But yeah, there's a lot of that crossover, which is cool. But at the same time, where are my squats?
Right. Dwarves are awesome.
Well, they're just dead. I mean, they got rid of them the right way.
Well, they're actually there's actually
Demiurge,
the Demiurge, that trade openly with the Tau currently. So there's a chance that they're coming back.
Like Demiurge is
area.
Yeah.
What, the Tau don't know what squats are. So when they explain what Demiurge are,
tiny human.
When they explain what Demiurge are, they're like, it sounds like squats.
Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much. Yeah, well, that was actually where we were going to kind of go with this episode originally, was talking about these little tidbits of lore, like what are the Demiurge and stuff like that, and we'll definitely get there. But you need a good foundation for a good house, right? Right, Mark?
What?
Is there no foundation under us?
Demiurge? What's a foundation?
Oh God!
No, this house is just on pillars.
Oh yeah. The pillars of this house.
There's a lot of dirt and dead bodies down there, but I mean, I don't know about foundation.
They're not all dead.
Like the foundation of the empire.
Hey. Every world is a tomb world.
And Daddy Boys.
Daddy Boys.
Daddy Boys.
Sleepy dead boys.
Guys. So yeah, to kind of dive into our main topic here, Warhammer 40k is the godfather of the grimdark setting. But what does that mean? So to me, that's a big mix of existential horror, gritty science fiction, and war stories. There is a lot of focus on dystopian themes, amoral choices, and kind of the violence that exists in that kind of gritty, war-torn world. In fact, the tagline of Warhammer 40k does very specifically say, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. What does grimdark mean to you guys?
So, I mean, it's basically just like what you said. It's the conflict, the just terribleness of it all. Like when I'm reading the books anyways, especially like through Gaunt's Ghosts, like you're just imagining like just it's dark, there's gunfire everywhere, there's dirt flashing, smoke you can't see what's going on, and then there's just this maelstrom of combat happening around these characters, and it's just there's no hope. It's pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, for me, grimdark is like almost mindset.
It's a subgenre,
right? Yeah, like grimdark. Like when you think grimdark, you're like it's so depressing it makes your life feel better. that is grimdark.
At least I'm not there.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Like I mean, you talk about like Imperial Guard, and you're like, this guy's fighting for his life every day. Like there's plants that will fucking eat your brain and turn you into a zombie, and then make you kill your friends. And then and I'm angry on a Monday morning because I got to go to work.
Right.
But I, hey, I'm not getting my, I don't have bacteria, crawling up my pee hole and turning my wiener into like a Slanesh demonette. This is Grimdark.
I mean, turning my penis into a
demon. It doesn't sound bad, right?
Anyway, I don't want
doesn't sound bad.
I mean, like that meme that I posted to chat, it was a picture of the guardsman trying to like get across. Dude's literally just trying to cross like a pool of water, and then a swarm of little tyrannid piranha things are trying to eat his ass.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
Just daily life in the guard.
You're like, it's like it's not Monday for him. That's Friday. You know what I mean?
Like this is his best.
Like that's his best day, right? So that's kind of Grimdark for me.
Grimdark for me is the physical embodiment of goth kids.
Oh yeah, dude, that was totally. I got into this because I was like, "What's the goth Star Wars?" Like that was.
Goth,
I was like, "What's goth Star Wars?" All right, we got Warhammer.
It's goth kids. I mean, like. It is literally like when you're in middle school and high school, when I was younger, there was always those goth kids. And I was like, damn, dude, they got them big boots and they're all into black and pentagram and stuff. And then when I saw Warhammer, I was like, this is goth. This is just goth as F, man. Like, this is what it is.
All right, dis metal.
Yeah. So I was
Metal
like, this,
AF,
I was into heavy metal and I love goth chicks. And this has all of that in it. So that's what Grimdark is to me. It's
Demon that booty hole, man.
It's goth chicks. It's goth chicks and heavy fucking metal.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
It's definitely heavy metal. Yeah. So unlike Star Trek or even something more space fantasy like Star Wars that we mentioned, 40k really does steer into that deeper shadows of the dark alley, putting forth speculations about what might go bump in the night and how much it may want to eat you, as Mark kind of got towards there. Some of these themes that most Warhammer fans like us all seem to enjoy. As you guys pointed out, I'm a huge horror head. I love my monster feature movies. I love weird aliens. I love what? Forearmed Empathy? What? Oh, horror. Yes, I'm a big.
Is there more R's in there?
Yeah, there are. There's a.
So I'm saying it wrong. Horror.
Yeah, just kind of that grittier side.
I already said goth chicks.
He did. Yeah, grittier side of space. Like goth chicks loved Lovecraft. I loved Lovecraft.
Exactly.
So it happened.
Oh yeah, all
it's
spooky elements of Lovecraft are definitely.
I am 100% correct.
Oh yeah, you are.
Oh yeah, goth.
There's that whole thing where we all kind of have properties that we're all attracted to. One of them is Battlestar Galactica. Same fucking thing, dude.
Oh, don't get me started.
Oh
dude,
yeah,
it's that gritty. It's that grittier side of
humanity's
sci-fi.
nuked. We're probably not going to make it. This is the last group of people trying.
Yeah, dude, those first like 4 or 5 episodes where there's a fucking body count, not a body count, there's a population count that keeps dropping.
Yeah,
and like that's a focus.
Planet, like they show a new planet. Yeah,
22 minutes.
20. Yeah, dude, that fucking episode. Yeah, so there's that old joke. I'm sure you guys have heard it. Like, you talk to fans, right? And fans are like, hey, you're a Lord of the Rings fan. Would you like to live in the Shire? Oh yeah, I'd like to live in the Shire. Hey, you're a Star Wars fan. Would you like to live in Star Wars universe?
Yeah, totally. Why not?
Yeah, cool, right?
You get to fly X-Wing.
Yeah. You like Star Trek. Would you love to live in Star Trek?
Yeah, that'd be pretty cool. Cool shit there.
Yeah, right. Hey, Tom, you're a fan of 40k, right? You want to live in the 40k universe?
Depends.
Wait, you were supposed to say fuck no.
I just said I love goth chicks.
You're an Imperial Guard in 40k.
Yeah.
No.
He'd like to live in Cormorant, is what he's saying.
Yeah, I was like, I just said I love goth chicks. Like, wrong person to ask.
You're like,
tie me up and hand me to the Repentia.
You're like Dark Eldar?
Yeah, I'm like, Dark Eldar, what's up?
What's going on, bro?
You just had a whip? Let me get that.
Let me down with that, girl.
Get that. Oh, they got hooks.
As a primer, in general, Warhammer 40k takes place in a galaxy very similar to our own. So when we say the 41st millennium, we mean roughly 38,000 years from now. While it's probably unlikely that the Empyrean of Man used BC or uses AD as time units to separate history, it's pretty safe to assume that the 41st millennium is roughly 41,000 years after the beginning of recorded human history.
Well, BC AD, what is that? Before Christ.
Before Christ.
After
and
death?
No, it's
Anno Dominus.
Amina Dominus.
Oh my God, it's a bunch of words I don't know. Jesus Christ.
Some of it almost sounds like Warhammer, though.
AD
okay.
doesn't mean after death. It means Amina.
I know. I was just fucking around.
Oh, okay, got you.
Yeah, I was just making up words. Like you.
So yeah. So in general, if you were to think of like the beginning of recorded history being like 3800 BC, for instance, Warhammer 40k takes place 41,000 years after that. We're going to refer to a lot of events by like M37, for instance, or M38. In the case of M37, that means it happens in the years between 30,000 and 37,000 and 37,999. There's a lot more to how the Imperium records time, but we're not going to dive really deep into that in this episode. Before we dive any deeper into it, it's also important to note that most of Warhammer 40k's lore is told from humanity's perspective. Everything is presented as the Imperium of man would understand it. Even if you engage, like many of us do, in the lore or hobby from another faction's perspective, both Tom and I are Xenos players, as an example. It's just kind of good to keep in mind most of the information we're going to present is from that perspective. It's from humanity's records.
Like a quick example of that, if I remember right, like the Tau suit designations, like they all have like Riptide, things like that.
Those are all
human designations for those Tau vehicles.
Imperial. Yeah, okay.
Right. It's what they're recorded as in our history.
Okay.
But when you buy the codex, like everything is presented from how humans view your faction. Right. And that's actually bringing up the Tau is a good point, because a lot of people point to the Tau as being like fish people. The Tau have like hooves.
They have hooves. They don't have flippers. It's just all their ships are shaped like fish.
No. So the reason that comes from is due to the names. But what you have to take into account is that the ones that name things are the water cast.
Right. Yeah. I remember mentioning that.
The translation from Tau to Gothic,
is going to
it ends up becoming aquatic names for things.
That makes sense.
Even though those aren't the true names. That's just what the Imperium has translated it to be.
And as human players playing the game, not in the 41st millennium, the codex we buy is presented by archivists from the 45th millennium.
Right. It's almost
it's a really weird. It's very fun. Anyway, before we dive into this brief exploration of the history of everything, from us landing on the moon all the way to the fall of Acadia, we have Brother Brutus with us today, and he's going to help set the mood.
He's a big motherfucker. Let me just tell you right now.
It is the 41st millennium. For more than 100 centuries, the Emperor has sat immobile on the golden throne of Earth. He is the master of mankind, by the will of the gods, and master of 1,000,000 worlds by the might of his exhaustible armies. He is a rotting carcass, writhing invisibly with power from the dark age of technology. He is the current lord of the Imperium, for whom 1,000 souls are sacrificed every day, so that he may never truly die. Yet even in his deathless state, the Emperor continues his eternal vigilance. Mighty battle fleets cross the daemon-infested miasma of the warp, the only route between distant stars. Their way lit by the Astronomicon, the psychic manifestation of the Emperor's will. Vast armies give battle in his name on uncounted worlds. Greatest among his soldiers are the Adeptus Astartes, the Space Marines, bioengineered super warriors. Their comrades in arms are legion, the Imperial Guard, and countless planetary defense forces, the ever-vigilant Inquisition and tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus, to name only a few. But for all their multitudes, they are barely enough to hold off the ever-present threat from Xenos, heretics, mutants, and worse. To be a man in such times is to be one amongst untold billions. It is to live in the cruelest and most bloody regime imaginable. These are the tales of those times. Forgot the power of technology and science, for so much has been forgotten, never to be relearned. Forgot the promise of progress and understanding, for in the grim dark future there is only war. There is no peace amongst the stars, only an eternity of carnage and slaughter, and the laughter of thirsting gods.
Yeah, forearm nipper.
What?
Forearm nipper?
And he just walked out. He's a big motherfucker. What is he? Flesh tears, Kevin?
I didn't ask.
Yeah, I didn't want to ask.
We had to install special doors.
Yeah.
Yep.
He's scary.
So we're going to focus on trying to get actually into the history of the 41st millennium as quickly as possible, because that's the timeline that most of the games and most of the events of the current game take place.
We just need some of the old lore to back it up.
It's just important. Yeah. Like, as Kevin mentioned, it's just important to get a few bits of ancient history out of the way, as well as some of the inverse or canon in-universe or canon rules just sort of on the table before we get there. First, let's talk about the ridiculous size in the Milky Way galaxy. If you know anything about how space travel works, it's slow. Thankfully, they've got the warp, which allows most of the races in Warhammer 40k to bend the rules of physics. With the vast distances of space in mind, it's important to understand that some of the events are separated and distorted by relativistic speed of light and how that limit is set, broken, and overcome. First off, the warp is another layer of reality. It's a bit like the general science fiction concept of hyperspace. It's removed from the material plane or the observable physical galaxy, and therefore not bound by the same laws of traditional physics. The materium is the material plane, our physical galaxy, and the immaterium is the extra-dimensional space of the warp. Most races in Warhammer 40k can access the warp or parts of the warp through technology in order to traverse vast distances in relatively short amounts of time. However, it's important to remember that the warp is not stable. It isn't safe, and it's far from empty. It's a reflection of the emotional turmoil of mortal races who call the materium home. A good way to think of the warp is to look at it like an old sea map. Sure, you can travel a lot faster if you're willing to head out over the open ocean, but once you get out of sight of the land, everything becomes a lot more dangerous. Then go ahead and mix in the whole idea that there be monsters is real. The difference is that the warp monsters feed and grow on your fear and your emotion. In fact, if they cross over into our world, they'll feed on your body or even your soul. The four biggest of these monsters are called the Chaos Gods, which have largely been fed by the emotions of specifically the Eldar and now the humans. These big four scheme and plot and war as much with each other as they do against the races of the Materium in order to consume, corrupt, and eventually spread the warp directly into the Materium.
There's six, Ryan. You forgot Gork and Mork.
Gork and Mork, yeah. We'll get to orky stuff. There are much bigger things on the warp than the Chaos Gods.
Yeah, that's right.
But in order to look at what we're going to talk about today, we'll be dealing with the big four.
Before you get there, real quick, it's kind of, if you wanted I was thinking a modern kind of analogy for the warp would be kind of like the Upside Down from Stranger Things.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
Literally like a mirror of their town, and it's all their psychic shenanigans are all focused around that relationship between the real world and their parallel in the Upside Down, where all the nasty stuff happens.
That's a good place to look at it. The warp,
for a modern analogy, anyways.
The warp is as Kevin's pointing out, it's one of the more interesting concepts of Warhammer 40k, since it introduces a lot of this kind of magical thinking, magical reasoning. It also dabbles in a little bit of that existential horror, and even some of the fantasy concepts that you'd find outside of a general sci-fi setting. Kevin's got a good take looking at it as the Upside Down, or my traveling on the open ocean analogy. Right. How do you guys frame it?
Event Horizon.
Yeah, 100%.
Or Hellraiser. Very much like it is and it isn't in the same instance. Like some people believe that there are like multiple dimensions and parallel universes and stuff. And the way that I feel that the warp is that instead of that theory, it's just the one. And that one is the complete opposite of what we are, and that's why like demons and such things. And that's why you can trace them all the way back to the beginning of time, is because like the relationship between the immaterium and the materium go hand in hand. It's very much like, if it's not this, it's that. And if it's not that, it's this, so that's kind of like my basic, understanding of it.
Yeah, so it's kind of funny you guys mentioned that, like how you all have like different analogies for the warp. I'm actually I'm not reading because I don't read. I'm actually listening to a book called The Eye of Terror. I think it's actually an old school book.
Yeah.
But the way that they actually describe it in that book is that the navigators, the guys who actually navigate through the warp, with the Emperor's Astronomicon, every navigator actually sees the warp in a different way.
Yeah.
So like this navigator that I'm listening to in the book, he actually sees it as like a dense jungle. And so, and he actually says like every navigator perceives the warp in a different way as they navigate through it. And the warp is almost described as like, we're in a 3-dimensional world where, we obviously perceive it in that way. The warp is like 9+ dimensional. Like it's so imperceivable to the human mind. And that's why navigators have that warp eye to help them perceive that and to cope with that 9-dimensional like perception. They perceive it in their own way to help them navigate through it. And
Okay,
then like
so it's their brain like
exactly.
The important part is that the warp allows humanity in all the races of the Warhammer 40k universe to break the laws of physics when it comes to communication and travel.
It's their way of storying out faster than light travel, faster than light communication, and the magic.
Which, when you think about it, is very smart from a storyteller standpoint.
Oh yeah, it's
pack all three
brilliant.
of these things into one.
It's like a catch-all, right?
And it's the bad guy.
Yeah,
Man,
and
genius.
And when we're mentioning demon, the term that Warhammer uses is actually daemon, and daemon is a term from ancient Greek, which
Space
actually
Marine said it that way. The Space Marine said
he
it
did.
that way.
He said it earlier.
Daemon actually means divine or supernatural being that is stuck somewhere between godhood and humanity. Christianity, as it does, borrowed ancient beliefs from other religions and folded it into the term of demon. We talked about the big four, and there's a lot of back and forth as to whether or not all of the entities that live in the warp are negative, or whether or not the 4 chaos gods are the worst or the biggest. As Mark brought up, technically Gork and Mork are much bigger and much more powerful than the chaos gods, but Gork and Mork also don't really care to mess with with the material
they have too
universe.
much fun fighting each other.
Yeah.
So why fight with puny gods when you can fight with big
orky
gods?
Yeah. When you can bitch slap all 4 chaos gods across the room,
you're not going to deal with it. You look at your big brother and you're like, oh, I'm gonna whoop his ass.
Oh yeah. And there's probably much more ancient beings that live in the warp than even Gork and Mork. It's the warp is not empty. But we did bring up the 4 chaos gods, so let's go ahead and talk about them right now because they're going to be important pretty soon. In a lot of ways, Slaanesh is considered to be the youngest of the chaos gods. She is the god of excess, referred to as she who thirsts, also referred to as the dark prince. But Slaanesh's domain is essentially hedonism, drug, sex, and rock and roll taken to an extreme. Who wants to jump in with
all things pleasurable?
Oh yeah,
I'm down with that.
Well, it's pleasure. It's pleasure to excess. It's pleasure to pain.
Yeah,
it's pushing the extreme
I
to
remember
madness.
there was a little clip from an audio kind of excerpt I was listening to, and it was like somebody trapped in like a Slaanesh realm would basically like eat themselves to death. Like and then die on the table.
It's a 7
and the next
cents.
person would just continue eating off that dead person's plate. Like just keep going.
That's grimdark, baby.
Yeah.
As I said, I like goth chicks. So
Talk about how Slaanesh does you.
So actually in this book that I'm listening to,
that's why you're so eager.
Yeah. So the guy is actually he's actually a rogue trader, and that's why I think it's like super interesting. So he actually meets this group because he's trying to find goods. He's on the fringe worlds and whatnot, trying to find goods to sell. And he meets a group, and one of them is actually possessed by a Slaanesh demon, a chick. And the way he described her was that like
hot.
When she walked, he's like plump breast and a rump as big as like as big as the horizon. And like he's like, when she walks into the room, it's like it's like ecstasy. Like she would drag her finger across my back, and it was like my eyes would roll back behind my head. And this was before he knew it was a Slaanesh demon.
Right.
And then once he realized it was a Slaanesh demon,
it's like it all makes sense.
Yeah. She basically like it was to the point where he was out of he couldn't control himself. She like grew a tail. She had like a crab claw.
He was
and
like
she was
still hot.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And she like had her crab claw around his leg and was about to cut his leg off. And he was just like, yes, do it. Like, yes. And it was just like, God damn, bro. And like the guy reading it was like, so the way that they actually got rid of the demon because they wanted to keep the rogue trader alive, he actually shot her with a melta-gun. And but
just deleted her from existence.
But that's after she transformed. So what he did was he shot her with a melta-gun and she turned back into a normal human. But like in the thing, she was like, oh, and she's like, do it again, Barham. And it was the guy reading it. It was fucking hilarious.
As I said.
Well, yeah, there's little bits of
right.
There's always little bits of humor.
I had like a half chub, and I was like, dude, this guy reading it is like, God, he's in it, bro.
There's definitely like we're talking about a lot of very dark themes, but there's a lot of very silly, like just under the surface humor in Warhammer 40k.
Oh yeah, it was great.
So Slaanesh is one of them. Khorne is probably the next one that jumps to my mind. Khorne is the Lord of Skulls. He's the god of death and destruction and warfare, slaughter, open slaughter,
violence incarnate,
blood for the blood god,
skulls for the skull throne.
Hell yeah. Then there's Nurgle. Nurgle is sometimes referred to as Grandfather Nurgle.
Yes, nasty.
You got that good, bro.
The Lord of Life and Death, but it's a different type of life, and it's a different type of death. He's the rot god, the corruption god, plagues. Yep. Plagues, horrible things, all of that falls into the things that crawl in and out of your eyeballs, all fall into Nurgle's domain.
Yeah, because basically the whole thing of Nurgle is that through his corruption and his like decomposition of this plague and things like that, you are taking life, going through death and returning as new life, similar to like if you can imagine a mushroom.
Yep.
And the spore, it comes from compost and then it's born again.
Are we talking
as
orcs?
like a fungus. Well,
Are we talking orcs? Right?
Well, yeah, but I mean, it's the same, like that's the whole, like that's his whole thing.
Yeah.
The contagion.
The contagion.
Right.
It infects you and then you kind of go through your
He views it as a gift.
Yeah, Nurgle's gift is what he calls it.
And we talked a little bit last episode about which chaos god might be eldest, and there's actually a lot of argument back and forth that it very well could be Nurgle. As I had mentioned, he's called Grandfather Nurgle, and Nurgle is actually one of the chaos gods that even believers in the Emperor will openly worship. Like if you're sick, you might pray to Grandfather Nurgle to bring you relief or to bring you an exit. And you may not call him Grandfather Nurgle, but that's
Grandpapa Nurgle. Help me out.
And there's a lot of that, like obviously anybody praying for relief from like the flu is praying, is at the end of the day praying to Nurgle. Anybody involved in a fist fight is in essence praying for Khorne.
Hey, Khorne, give me strength.
Anybody doing a fat rail off of a
underhive stripper's asshole,
a three-tittied underhive.
A Thunder Warrior's asshole. I was like, damn, dude, that's dangerous. Yeah, that's high stress.
I was thinking the three-tittied Gene Stealer chick.
Yeah.
That's got to be a Gene Stealer model at some point. The three-tittied chick.
We literally talked about.
Yeah, I was talking about
making
because we talked about what was it, Ripley, and then Tom's like, I was like, yeah, and then I was also thinking Total Recall, and he's like, oh, dude, the mages as the three-titty girl.
Yeah,
I'm like, oh my god, I totally fucked this up.
The mutants as them.
Yeah, it's so good.
The very final, or not necessarily the final of the big chaos gods, but the last one we're going to talk about is Tzeentch. And Tzeentch is the Lord of Change, the schemer, generally seen kind of as the Lord of Magic, keeper of secrets. This is the whispering in the dark, the beginning of the corruption, the promise of power, all of that.
All according to plan.
Sort of like Loki.
Yeah, very good analogy.
A little bit of Loki.
He's actually my least favorite, to be honest.
Tzeentch is actually my favorite.
Yeah, I'm not a fan, dude.
I think he's cool because like as like a timeless being, it would make sense to kind of like weave a bunch of plans rather than just try to play
I'm more of the like, blood for the blood god, go in there, punch people in the dick kind of thing.
I mean, my absolute favorite chaos god is Abaddon the Despoiler, but we'll get to that later.
Excuse you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The armless?
By the way, Abaddon. I know that we're supposed to say Abaddon, but Abaddon. Sorry.
Is it really Abaddon?
Yeah, it's Abaddon.
Phenomena.
Phenomenon?
Bob, damn it. The spoiler. The spoiler. I actually have a huge soft spot in my heart for the Luna Wolves and therefore the Sons of Horus. So as we're still on the warp, there's a couple of other major issues with warp stuff. First off, it's really unpredictable. As an example, someone might arrive at their destination 25 years before they've even entered the warp, or they may not ever come out of the warp, or they could show up at a completely different destination. This, along with just distance, has generally made recorded history a bitch. The second issue with the warp and the materium is that they're not, the immaterium, the warp, and the materium, is they're not really separated by much. There's kind of like a thin membrane to reality in the Warhammer 40k world. And the warp can and often does leak into real space. This causes a bunch of different things, which are generally used under the blanket term of warp storms. And these can do everything from cut off a single planet to isolate entire regions of space. You've heard us mention it before, and we're going to mention it again. There's a huge permanent warp storm called the Eye of Terror. With all of that laid out, the Imperium basically has an above average chance of producing a lot of inconsistencies when it comes to the Imperial record. These gaps of the in-game record keeping have built in a pretty cool in-game justification for any retcons to history that might happen as the story of Warhammer 40k evolves. So it's a really good step from Game Workshop to do this, because a lot of the reasoning behind this allows them to treat their own in-game IP as sort of a living history or a living lore. And it can be revised when it needs to be, and it can be expanded by the company or even between the company and the community of players.
It gives them like a lot of mulligans, essentially. Right?
Exactly. Well, and it allows you to tell a collective story with the company.
That's one of the best things about it that I've always found with the lore itself, is that it's fluid and it changes with the people that enter it. And it's very much written by Games Workshop as much as it is written by you and me.
Yeah.
You know,
I mean, that's part of the fun though, right? Like the fact that there's so many, there's so much out there and it's all different.
And if I remember right, there was like, I could be completely remembering wrong, but wasn't there a Games Workshop event that actually, like a tournament that kind of determined the turn the lore was taking?
They've done it a couple of times. The end times in Warhammer Fantasy Battle definitely did it. There was the McCraig stuff.
Right. The Battle of McCraig was like an actual tournament or something.
Oh, dang. Okay.
Yeah. And we already talked a little bit about the Black Library with Kevin, which is like the official Warhammer channel for releasing a lot of this fiction.
I believe it's their publishing company that they do all their books in.
But it also means that a lot of the lore is pretty fun to mess with, as Tom just mentioned. What that does for players is it kind of establishes setting rules or trapping rules, which make it easy for us to come up with our lore rather than following a specific set of characters. You know, when you think about like the Starhammer, it's our next podcast, Starhammer. When you think about the Star Wars universe, there's a lot of specific characters and there's a lot of specific story beats. You know, now the Star Wars universe kind of has the same thing going on with it, but there's a lot more rules. But like the Warhammer world is just one of those things where like we might have some of these named characters in our armies, but we also have a lot more of our own stuff.
If you want to look at it as comparable between Star Wars lore and then the lore of 40K, the entire story of Star Wars could be a story that you and your friends made up in the world of 40K.
Exactly.
That's how vast it is. Yeah. And how much freedom you have as a player to create your own story.
It's essentially like the Wild West of like space and like scientific like genre. Sci-fi genre. Yeah, thank you. It's like the Wild West. You can just do whatever you want and it makes sense.
Yeah, there's such a variation of planets, locations.
You want
cultures.
My Little Pony Space Marines? Boom, you got it.
Yeah. And
like, no joke, you actually could.
And Tom's current army build is a pretty good example of this, because Tom is running with stuff that is very lorically based.
So good.
But he's tweaking it in a way that makes it not only his own, but incorporates other fandom stuff that he wanted to incorporate.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's not every day you hear about Imperial Knights that are Disney characters.
It's pretty damn cool.
And like the first time he pitched that, I was like, oh, I don't know, dude. And then he like just kind of talked about it a little bit, and we'll get into it in the future podcast, episode 40. And
episode 40.
And just like when he actually pitched the lore, I was like, my God, this is amazing.
It makes sense.
It's so good.
I made it make sense.
It's so good.
The first sentence, I was like,
I don't know. And then by the time he finished the second sentence, I was like, I'm sold.
It's like, dude,
On
you
board.
had me in the first half, man.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that's a lot of the reason that we actually got together to do this podcast. That's the fun that we take out of the game. And we want to kind of talk about that stuff, you know, give new players, give new people that are finding us and are interested kind of an idea and a base. And then just sort of talk about how we tell stories to inspire you guys to tell some awesome stories, and then email us your awesome stories so we can read them too.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love hearing lore. dude.
I love
so
hearing
awesome.
lore stuff, but I really, really like custom lore stuff.
Oh yeah, custom
Homebrew
lores.
lore stuff. I'm like,
Oh, yeah.
That's that good.
that's the money nuts.
That's that money nut.
But to get there, we got to get through some of this stuff. So
Get back to the official stuff.
yeah, let's knock this prehistory out of the way as quickly and as painlessly as possible. So as mentioned in our clarifications, there was a war fought a long time ago between the Necrontyr and the Old Ones. This is referred to as the War of Heaven, and it happened millions of years before humans even were a blink in a god's eye. It's generally theorized that the Old Ones, as we mentioned, seeded most life in the galaxy, with the Eldar and the Kork being the forerunners of the Orc, both being created as weaponized races to fight against the Necrontyr. Towards the end of this conflict, the Necrontyr died out as a biological species and became the Necron. We'll get into the Necron a little bit in a coming episode, probably part 2 of this one. But for right now, just realize the Necrontyr died out and became the Necron, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the Necrontyr exist anymore, nor does it mean that they're really gone. Sometime after this conflict, humanity rose to become an interstellar civilization and spread across the stars in a generalized, let's say, Star Trek-like era. This is referred to as the Golden Age of technology.
Yes.
This was pretty quickly followed by the Dark Age of technology.
Oh no.
Imagine that.
This era saw the rise of killer AI robots in the Men of Iron, and the first widespread cases of intergalactic warfare, with humanity expanding basically so quickly that we wore ourselves thin and then either turned on ourselves or ran headlong into vast Xenos species and empires that just weren't having us.
A little bit like the Romans.
Oh yeah. And as that stuff, yeah, a lot like the Romans.
Yeah, or Dead Space.
Yeah.
To be lost.
That's
Yeah.
that's it.
Empty.
Or Dead Space the game.
yeah, right.
Yeah, the necromorphs.
Them spider babies.
Yeah. So as this contraction happened and the age of the Dark Age of technology kind of hammered us pretty bad, another age came about, which was called the Age of Strife.
That's my favorite.
During all of this turmoil of the relatively young humanity, the Eldar race was busy birthing, Slaanesh.
Birthing how?
Well, they hate
Eldar.
they
party.
hate fucked
Funny
a god
question.
That's
into
my
existence.
favorite way to say that. They hate fucked a god into existence.
Funny question.
Yeah. So during the beginnings, during the tail end of the Dark Age of technology and the beginning of the Age of Strife is about when all of that Eldari hate fucking Slaanesh into existence happened. And this actually marked the long and still suffering today decline of the Eldari people. That gets us to the 31st millennium. This is a very important and busy chunk of this timeline, and it covers a lot of events and sets up a lot of what makes up the human-based factions and the Xeno-based factions and how they're played currently in the lore. It was in this relatively brief period of history that the Emperor revealed himself, came to power, united Earth in the Unification Wars, reconnected with the Tech Priests of Mars, and then launched a massive crusade to claim the rest of the galaxy in the name of humanity. It was toward the end of this era that the Emperor's favored son, Horus, fell to the forces of chaos and started a brutal civil war that tore the galaxy and humanity apart.
Say it ain't so.
Resulting in the Emperor's fatal wounding and his subsequent entombment on the Golden Throne of Terra, and the chaos-worshipping side of humanity retreating into the Eye of Terror.
Now, there's actually like a cinematic of this, right? The drops. Was it drop side?
Drop site massacre? No.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, that's
I
just
haven't
a
seen
battle.
any.
Oh,
Yeah,
really?
it's just a huge battle. It's like
Yeah.
what set it off.
What was the one with
So-
the Ultramarines and Luna Wolves?
You're talking about the drop site massacre of Istavan 5.
Yeah.
That was the so
Am I
there
there
had been
it up?
no that was
You're thinking of Death of Hope, which was a fan-made video
right.
of
that
the
was-
Ultramarines fighting the Luna Wolves.
right.
and
that wasn't.
that was like the Siege of McCrag or something.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so that was
Yeah.
a
That was
different.
just them fighting.
So the
Gotcha.
Drop site massacre.
The drop
is when
site
they tricked.
massacre is pretty much the first big Horus revealed his hand to the loyalist forces. Now, there's a lot of sources out there, guys, about the Horus heresy. There's an entire book line in the Black Library. There are podcasts that cover this stuff in a little bit more detail. And we're definitely interested in coming back to this stuff at some point, but we're not going to kind of walk everybody through the Horus heresy today.
Horus turned out to be a bad guy.
Yeah.
He came back burning his way home.
The
and then the emperor died.
The Horus heresy itself is multiple episodes of itself. I mean, it is so majority of the books that are out for Warhammer lore, half of them are about the heresy.
Yeah, there's 44 books in the Horus heresy, and I'm currently reading the Siege of Terra, and I'm on the 3rd book in the 8-book planned siege, which is just the siege at the end of the Horus heresy. They're planning
just the siege of the Imperial Palace.
Yeah.
Also worthy of note is that while Horus was doing his little rebellion, that caused a rift or a schism and its own civil war in the Mechanicum, which is kind of a separate organization from the rest of the Imperium. But it was directly related to Horus and his rebellion, which then resulted in a lot of loss of technology for the setup of the rest of the story.
Like the Adeptus Mechanicus, right?
Oh,
right.
God, the Dark Mech.
Yeah.
Yeah. I forgot about that.
That is
Dark
entirely
Mechanicus.
the birth of the Dark Mech.
I forgot about them.
And you guys will hear a lot about the Dark Mech, because
Right,
I'm
and that
a big
was a
Dark
bunch of
Mech
tech
guy.
priests who weren't happy with their deal with the Emperor,
Yeah.
and so they sided with Horus.
He's like, make me guns, and they're like, no.
Well, there was a big so the Emperor understood. The Emperor understood the dangers of human curiosity and human technological involvement, and put stops on the Mechanicus on certain types of research they were allowed to do. Because the Emperor basically knew that the warp existed before people knew the warp existed. You know, we take it for granted as players and as, you know, people enjoying the 41st millennium of content that people know of the ruinous powers. In you know, the 31st millennium, the Emperor was hiding all that crap.
Oh yeah, I mean, even now, like in the present, like present 40k, there's people that never seen a demon.
Yeah,
and they're like, oh, if you see a demon, the Inquisition's going to come after you.
Yeah,
and like over. it's well known that like the Grey Knights, like just knowing that the Grey Knights exist then tells you that demons exist, so you get to die.
Them Grey boys come up soon. There's a lot. You know, we'll definitely circle back. Let us know if you guys want to hear more about this too, and our opinions about a lot of this stuff, because we'll definitely share it with you as we get deeper into the podcast. But yeah, that gets us into the age of the Imperium. But let's take a second to go over how the Imperium is governed and organized. You know, at one point, the Emperor wasn't trapped in a state of undeath and was much more active in the general administration of the Imperium.
Say it ain't so.
Yeah, that don't happen no more. Well, it's important to note that some people do continue to have access to the Emperor's throne room, predominantly Reboot and some of his custodies, which are his own personal bodyguards. And he can apparently communicate. If the Emperor is still alive in that way, his entire presence is really focused on maintaining something that's called the Astronomicon. The Astronomicon is basically a giant beacon that's projected into the warp that is used by the navigator houses and by the astropaths for both warp travel and faster than light communications. Because of this, all of the Imperium is basically governed by 4 main bodies. With the High Lords of Terra governing over the Adeptus Terra, which is the priesthood of Terra, the Adeptus Mechanicus, which is the priesthood of Mars, and the Adeptus Ministorum, or the state church. Now, there's a 4th body that I mentioned, and I haven't named them yet. They're called the Inquisition, and they're the secret police, and they kind of sit to the side and watch over everybody.
Nobody expects the Inquisition.
To very quickly break down each of these branches, the largest function of the Adeptus Terra, the largest in function, is the Adeptus Terra, and it includes most of the functional parts of government, things like administration, communications, commerce, law and order, all that good stuff. We'll talk a bit more about that stuff in depth when we actually get around to doing some of our Hive City stuff, under the Hive of Madness and all, because the Arbites come into play a lot when you talk about the Adeptus Terra and how it,
5-0.
yeah, the Administratum works. The Adeptus Mechanicus is responsible for building and maintaining machines, making new weapons of war, and resupplying the Imperium with technology.
And for getting their place.
It's important to remember that the Mechanicus is separate from the Imperium while still being part of the Imperium. We'll kind of get into that a little bit more in the future, but just realize that the Adeptus Mechanicus is from Mars, and they're the priesthood of Mars. And when the Empire was founded, it was basically Earth at 50% control and the Mechanicum at 50% control. It's sort of shifted and it's a little hazy, but that's how these things work. The Adeptus Ministorum, or the Ecclesiarchy, maintains the imperial truth in the imperial creed. Essentially, in the Warhammer 40k universe, as a human, you either follow the religion the state dictates you, or you're dead. The Inquisition is a beast, as I mentioned, onto itself, and most likely should be the subject of a future podcast. But in brief, like the name suggested, they're the secret police of the Imperium, and they're split into 3 ordoses. Ordo Hereticus confronts the threat within, Ordos Xenos confronts the threat without, and Ordos Malleus confronts the threat from beyond. There's an uncountable subdivisions and even smaller ordoses, but ultimately, this is the briefest breakdown of how this government functions. I think I got all of it, guys.
Yeah, that sounds like you've covered pretty much all of it. You've got the 3 Ordos, and everything pretty much either falls within one of those.
Yeah.
And then
what does the Assassinorum fall under?
The Assassinorum falls under the Adeptus Terra.
Okay, not the Inquisition.
It does not fall under the Inquisition.
Really?
Yeah. In fact, the Officio Assassinorum fucks with history a lot.
Oh, really?
Yeah. We'll probably do some Assassinorium related content at some point. We're going to very briefly touch it.
The only 2 organizations, like imperial wide organizations, that I would say you didn't touch on would be the Imperial Navy, which is part of the
Adeptus Terra. We'll actually get to that really quickly.
The
here.
Departmento Munitorum, which is basically the land forces.
Yeah.
There is something to be said about the Titanicus legions, because they operate somewhat outside of the Imperium. They operate kind of on their own, like forges.
The Collegia Titanica is definitely its own beast.
It's kind of a separate division of the Mechanicum.
Yeah, exactly. And in that you also get into the Imperial Knights and their own home worlds, and more or less how they govern themselves. They govern themselves separate from the Imperium, unless they have 2 different classes. The Mechanicus side and the Imperium side. So the Knights are actually split into where they like honor their allegiances to.
And that's what I was actually what I was going to say was that as you mentioned, the Collegia Titanica, but they do kind of fall, like some of them side with the Adeptus Terra.
It literally comes down to them siding with the Imperium, or the Greater Imperium, or the Greater Mechanicum.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So after the Horus Heresy, the timeline moves officially into what's called the Age of Imperium, which is largely considered to be the present age of the game, even though it covers a ridiculous amount of time. From M31 to M42.
And isn't it, with the advent of 9th, that was when it rolled to M32, correct?
No, that would be M42.
Yeah, so I said M42.
I thought you said 32.
I think you said 32.
Oh, did I say 32? Oh, my bad. I meant 42.
So technically,
30K, and then the Age of Imperium starts right after 30K.
Yep.
It rolls forward. 40K is where the game takes place.
Yep.
And then they officially said that it's rolled to M42.
Yeah, and I've always wondered that, just kind of like on the hobby side of this, like when I play 40K, like where are we at with the lore? And that's kind of what
generally speaking, when we play a game, when we sit down and play a table game of Warhammer 40k, I kind of always assume, since none of us are, well, you are, none of us are really playing Primaris stuff. I have always sort of considered, yeah, I know you are now, but in our early games, when in our early 9th games, you aren't running Primaris yet and all that stuff. I kind of always just sort of generally assumed that we were running somewhere in late M41. Like 783 to
somewhere in the last
M41,
several hundred years, kind of time
right before the Primaris got rolled out.
Literally my entire army was right before, and now my army is basically, when it comes to Tau, has been literally the time before the Great Rip and now.
Yeah, and
that's where my army takes place.
We'll get to the big ripcord.
The big rip.
Yeah, so as you guys mentioned, technically 9th edition, you can make an argument that we're now moving into the era of Indominus, but whether or not the era of Indominus is technically out of the age of Imperium hasn't really been settled on.
Right, it's almost like a sub-age.
Yeah, essentially. There's a lot of information about all these eras, but we're going to just kind of try to focus on a lot of the stuff that gets us to the 41st and spend a good amount of time on those actual events. So we're just going to kind of touch on major stuff that help get the game set up. The early age of Imperium, the time of rebirth, took place between M31 and M32. It was right after the events of the Horus Heresy and the fall of the Emperor. And it deals with a lot of the cleanup that happens after a century of civil war. I'm not a century of war. It was it was cleanup over centuries because of a relatively short civil war. The traitor legions were driven back into the Ire Terror. Most of the Primarchs either fell or have completely vanished from the scene.
And that's both loyalist and traitor Primarchs.
Yep, correct.
It evened it out on both sides. It thinned the herd and brought it back to the...
do you guys know, off the top of your head, who was left? Or was there no one?
At this point, Sanguinius,
Heresy, Russ, Khan, the Lion, and Dorn were all alive.
But so nobody like Roboot,
at this point,
that all happened in kind of what he's saying, the cleanup. They started all either falling off or disappearing one by one.
At this point in the history, the only one that's really going to matter for a while is Reboot.
Okay, yeah.
So as we were saying, a lot of the Primarchs either fell off or vanished from the scene. At the same time, the power vacuum that was left by the Great Crusade and its following conflict left this big opening for Xenos races to reclaim their territories once again. Another important note is during these early years of the Healing Imperium, Reboot Gilliman took steps to reshape the military and administration organization of the Imperium so that no single person could ever wield as much power as Horus did again. Several governmental bodies were created to put in place to take over for the Emperor, who is no longer alive enough to fulfill these duties. The Imperial Army, as Kevin mentioned, was split into two major branches, the Imperial Navy and the Imperial Guard. There's been some rebranding, but that's their designations as of M32.
And that, long story short, that was to keep, that was part of their breaking up mixed unit divisions. So for the same reason that they downsized Space Marines so that no one person could command a whole legion.
Yeah.
They were like, all right, tank regiment, you're over here.
Oh, so they did the same to the Imperial Guard as well then.
Basically.
They did the same thing. They broke the Navy from the Guard. So that way, if a Guard commando or commander went traitor, well, he's stuck on a planet.
Which is not
no Navy, Navy to take him anywhere.
Yeah, you basically...
If a Navy commander went rogue, well, what's he going to do? Land?
Yeah. They basically made sure to further subdivide this stuff into these independent bureaucracies.
And that way they would have to work together to be able to achieve anything major.
The last big part of this was the creation of the Codex Astartes, which divided the loyalist Space Marine legions into Space Marine chapters, which were set to be no more than 1,000 Marines apiece. Remember the power vacuum that we were talking about a little bit earlier? Towards the end of M32, there were suddenly orcs. We'll get a lot deeper into the beast and various major wogs in a later episode.
The old foe.
Oh, yeah.
I love orcs.
The forging came next.
How can you be a Warhammer fan and not love orcs?
Right.
It's all the ridiculous things that people do, but cranked up to 11. And then we just do it cuz. It's cranked up to 11 just cuz.
The forging, which came next, took place between M32 and M35. This is sometimes referred to as the Golden Age of the Imperium. Most important worlds were brought back into the embrace of the Imperium. This is also when the astropath choirs were greatly expanded. This helped to establish better and more secure communications and even navigational means through the Immaterium so the Imperium could function. We'll talk probably a little bit more about navigators later, but it's good to mention that the astropath and the navigator houses work together, but they are different. They are separate organizations. Imperial tech had kind of begun to stagnate and even decline since the heresy. And it's during this time that there is the rediscovery of a lot of STCs. These are standard template constructs. These have been thought to have been lost or even were completely unknown of since the dark age of technology. It's also during this time that the religious beliefs in the emperor came to a fever pitch, and it was no longer easily ignored. Several minor cults were brought together into an official religious branch of the Imperium known as the Ecclesiarchy. So this would be when the Adeptus Ministorum was founded.
And it's almost comical, but it's a tragedy really, because it's that belief, that church that takes over is almost the complete opposite of what the Imperial
Emperor
wanted.
Yeah, what the Emperor wanted. The Emperor didn't
He wanted
want that,
science, logical reasoning.
not a religion around him.
Right. He wanted to be based off fact.
And we'll find out why. As the political turmoil continued on Terra, mostly between the High Lords, the Ecclesiarchy and the newly formed Adeptus Ministorum began to flex their muscle, launching crusades to reestablish or even conquer new shrine worlds. There are several incursions of the Chaos Warfleets at this time, and Chaos inspired lots of terror throughout the galaxy, establishing kind of the ever-present threat that at any point anybody can fall to Chaos. The events of the Paling and the Howling saw loss of countless systems and life across the growing Imperium and later parts of the era. We'll probably dive deeper into these events later, but just know that they happened. Then came the Nova Terra Integrorum, roughly between M34 to M35. This is a 900-year-long civil war, also known as the Time of the Twin Empires. A rebellious cult known as the Council of Nova Terra dismissed the authority of the High Lords and claimed a separate rule over a large chunk of the Imperium Segmenta Pacificus. This conflict fractured the Imperium into several warring factions and even saw expanded internal warfare inside the Adeptus Mechanicus. After almost 1,000 years of low-grade conflict and civil war, it was the Politica Macatian of the Ecclesiarchy that united the Imperium once again and led to the overthrow of the Council and the reestablishment of the High Lord's authority over the entirety of the galaxy under the Imperium. However, it also dangerously increased the power and authority of the Ecclesiarchy. Finally, the 21st founding, or the Cursed Founding, marked the end of this era. This was the largest founding since the second founding, which is when the Codex Astrades was adopted into rule. This founding was marred by attempts of the Mechanicus gene editors of Incuba to create a better space marine, the Homo sapien novus, which would have been kind of like a Primaris, but it failed. Their efforts, originally built to fix some of the gene mutations of the Space Marines, just ended up making it all worse. Most of these mutations pushed the acceptable limits, and the Inquisition and the Grey Knights were often called in to deal with it. As we've mentioned before, when the Grey Knights and the Inquisition come in to deal with stuff, people die.
It's bad.
It's not a good look.
Those are most of the major events from this chunk of time. Anything you guys wanted to add before we move on to the Age of Apostasy?
Is this kind of like the time that the Adepta Sororitas was created?
Nope. That's coming up.
That's coming up. Okay,
That's coming
That
up.
was apostasy, yeah.
Yeah, that's actually the very next thing.
And then,
Okay, gotcha, yeah.
real quick before is this what we were talking about with the beacon and the calling in the nasty bugs? Is that this? The Tyranids.
So there
We were talking about how it's kind of vague on the year specifically.
The call of the Tyranids and the waking up of the Necron are very much treated as things that the Imperium as a wide whole knows about now in M41. But part 2 of this episode, we're going to talk about that stuff specifically. So we'll kind of refer back to some of these eras. But for right now, that stuff kind of falls into all of
and this is why.
And nobody knew when it happened.
Yeah, that's the whole thing. That stuff showed up and no one knew what was going on.
The dude basically, long story short, dude hit a button, crazy shit happened. He's like, all right, cool, I'm gonna go home now. And then 1,000 years later, everybody's like, oh shit, we turned on the bug.
Basically what happened was somebody turned on the lamp and the moth was like, lamp?
Yeah.
I love lamp.
I love lamp. Lamp is life. Lamp is life.
And then it ate 3 or 4 whole lamps before anybody knew what was going on.
Yeah, and then there was a crazy inquisitor that fucking murdered and you know how when you do a fire break and you burn down part of the forest so the fire can't come forward.
Oh right.
So there was an inquisitor. I can't remember his name. Yeah, but there was some inquisitor that was like, "What if we just kill off an entire swath of planets? Then they will have nothing to eat to get to us." And the Inquisition was like, "Do not do that." And he's like, "Do that? Okay, I got it. Already done, boss."
Yeah, Grimdark.
Yeah.
We'll
talk about him. I imagine at some point. Yeah. So next,
talking about your worst day is a Monday at work. Well, these guys, they lost their whole planet.
Exterminatus.
But yeah, but I also wanted to just say this again. This is why I wanted to kind of do these episodes, because people try to look at lore and where to start, or okay, I'll start with 40k, the 30k heresy. I really like all this getting laid out, because it's like, oh, okay, that's that. Now I understand. Like this is what when it happened. So
and we're moving pretty fast. I mean, again, we just covered M31 to M35, which is like 5,000 years of history. I'm leaving some stuff out, guys. There's a lot more.
there's so much more.
Yeah,
many nuance.
Lots of nuance.
We turned like a 30 episode podcast into a 1 hour episode podcast
Because we're getting to the meat of how to get started in the hobby, and we'll definitely come back to some of this.
This
stuff.
is all important. Like this isn't the specific lore you'll need if you wanted to start playing,
right?
But that lore that you will need is based upon this lore. That we just
this is a prequel.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, when you go in and play, when you go in and you watch your first Warhammer 40k movie, you're just like, hey, these are some cool figs. And now we're talking about like you've gotten into it and you're watching the prequel movies.
Oh, it's like,
but they're really good prequel movies.
Like you can watch the
midi-chlorians,
the original 3, 4, 5, and 6, and you're like, oh, this is cool Star Wars. And then minus the trash that we can talk about the prequels, then you can go back and be like, oh, this is how all that got set up. That's cool.
And then you can watch the several seasons of the Clone Wars and be like, oh, they have good writers.
Yeah, and be like, oh, okay, I see how all these events set up everything that then happens later.
So next we have the Age of the Apostasy. This is M36. There's this. Congratulations, guys. Guess what? Brutal Imperial Civil War.
Again?
Yeah. Can we just hit a button? Brutal Imperial Civil War. Although this time it's pretty much based around the megalomaniacal machinations of the religious elite who all wish to rule the Imperium themselves, regardless of the belief in the Emperor's divinity.
Whole bunch of space popes.
Yep. Second only to the level of bloodshed and warfare that was seen during the heresy, this era is marked by the Reign of Blood, when High Lord Gaug Vandire, an insane tyrant, became both the ecclesiarch and the adaptus administrorum of the High Lords of Terra through blackmail, bribery, coercion, and outright murder. Wars of faith became commonplace as he attempted to gather and consolidate as much power as he could. All seemed lost until on the world of Dimamar, Sebastian Thor and his sect of the Imperial Cult, the Confederation of Light, denounced High Lord Vandire as a traitor to the Emperor. Thor gained support and led a crusade, including several Space Marine chapters and a huge chunk of the Imperial Guard forces, to lay siege to Terra again. In the end, Vandire was actually killed by his own bodyguard, the Brides of the Emperor, who were convinced that they had been tricked into betraying the Emperor by Vandire himself. In the aftermath of this conflict, Sebastian Thor was named the new ecclesiarch, and steps were taken to prevent the potential of similar events happening in the future. Most notably, the Brides of the Emperor were reformed into the Adaptus Sororitas, or the Sisters of Battle, to act as the armed forces of the ecclesiarchy. So there's kind of a funny story here. It's one of those like ha-ha moments that happens in 40K. Sebastian Thor, in the aftermath of all of this, said that never again shall the ecclesiarchy have men at arms. So they formed the Sisters of Battle.
Work around.
They aren't men.
Yep. This is also
This
when
clearly says men here.
men of arms. These are women.
Why not children
of arms?
Why not children?
Children of arms.
Because children are only good for team weapons like belt-fed machine guns and mortars.
Hey, what about orcs?
Oh, that's
at arms.
Yeah, and they're called cherubs.
Belt-fed cherub weapons
for children.
Children, my gun.
Yeah.
Child.
Battle children are just called cherubs.
So it's also at this time that the Inquisition formed the Ordos Hereticus, which we already talked about. And to give you guys kind of an idea of how all this stuff works together, the Adaptus Sororitas acts as the chamber militant for the Ordos Hereticus. So the Sisters of Battle can go to war on their own on a crusade, or the Inquisition can muster and send them out on an event.
Which is usually how they operate.
Yeah. And the Ordos Hereticus was kind of formed to like start looking into these religious people and to make sure that nobody ever rose to this like cult leader power again. Later in M36, warp storms became a big problem, including a giant expansion of the Eye of Terror, which increased the demand of psychers that needed to be sacrificed to the Emperor in order to fuel the Astronomicon. We haven't talked about it yet, but as Brother Brutus reminded us, 10,000 souls?
Isn't it 1 million?
I think it's 1,000 a day.
It's 1,000 souls a day are sacrificed.
It's
to the
1,000
Emperor.
souls a day, and There's a good YouTube. Baldermort actually has he wrote a nice little piece about
so
somebody getting
brutal.
sacrificed.
Yeah, like basically one of those psychers getting pulled from his planet.
He's like he lives on this backwater planet, gets taken on a black ship, dragged all the way there.
Coming.
I think Brutus is back.
Oh.
To be clear, it was 1,000 souls sacrificed every
my bad, man. Goddamn.
That's a lot of
so
souls,
at this time, the black ships increased in number and increased in how they processed psychers. We'll probably talk about the black ships later. Just they're terrible. The Age of Redemption, which was M37, this saw a zealotous flare as loyal followers of the Imperial Truth strode to prove their worth, kind of recapturing and unstaining themselves from the last millennia of conflict. Most of this was by targeting those that they saw less zealous, though. So, basically a bunch of people were like, no, I'm not horribly religious. I'm going to burn you because you're less religious than I am. Also, during this time, the Space Marines and other Imperial forces began a lot of crusades in an effort to push back and reclaim a lot of the territory that had been lost to Chaos, Orcs, and other Xenos threats. The Wrath of the Chaos Sun happened during this time. This was a massive explosion of a chaos-infused star, which just snuffed out several hundred systems and turned a lot of people into creepy chaos things. Yeah. The Grey Knights and several Space Marine chapters, along with the Adeptus Sororitas and lots of Imperial forces from the Navy and the Guard, were called into resulting battles. And this actually helped to heal a lot of the wounds of the Reign of Blood, all this working together to kind of overcome this big thing that happened. The High Lords of Terra began a great cull also at this time, kind of going through the ranks of the Adeptus Terra and just snuffing out anybody that they thought was at risk for becoming kind of a second coming of the Reign of Blood. Several other major events take place during this time. There's the Abyssal Crusade, which saw 30 Space Marine chapters that were found wanting in their devotion to the Emperor, sent specifically in the Eye of Terror to reclaim human worlds that had been lost during the birth of Slaanesh. While the Acculsade was a rogue Mechanicus uprising that threatened to cause massive issues, but was quickly brought down. Lastly, there's the Lost Crusade. This was essentially a bunch of young people in the Imperium citizenry who are campaigning for a more tolerant and accepted, almost greater good version of the galaxy. However, on their pilgrimage to Terra, they were lost in the warp.
Oh, that's most unfortunate.
Shocking.
Yeah, we're in the home. We're in the home stretch here, guys.
Just checking. Is this still 39?
This is M37.
Okay.
So yeah, next we're going to talk about the emergence of the Tau, which is M37 to M41.
That's a Tom special.
Oh yeah. In late M37, the Tau emerged onto the galactic scene when they were unified under the concept of the greater good. You guys remember when I just mentioned that a second ago?
The Tau Va.
Yeah. And underwent a rapid technological development into a spacefaring race. The Tau and the Imperium didn't really come into open conflict, though, until M41, when the Ultramarines clashed with the Tau forces around the planet of Malbeda. Am I saying that right? Malbeda?
Malbeda.
Yep, Malbeda.
That's Malbeda.
Based on these opening conflicts, the Tau and the Imperium, although there were these opening conflicts, I should say, the Tau and the Imperium haven't really clashed as much as the Imperium has clashed with other Xenos forces. A lot of this has to do with the Damocles Gulf and some of the stuff that's coming up now. But at this point, it was just the Tau, the Tau had been encountered about 3,000 years before this, and the Imperium was like, they ain't no big deal. And then all of a sudden they were like, wait, they've got railguns?
But even they've got railguns, they're still little fish, big pond.
It was they were basically like primitive, so they had like stone axes and things like that. They went from a stone age to a space age in 5,000 years.
Yeah, it's insane. There's the rapid expansion of the Tau Empire also led to many other Xenos races, such as the Kroot and the Vespid, and even several human worlds to fall under the banner of this emerging empire.
Go Vesa.
Yeah. So the Waning, which is M38. The Imperial forces at this point are pretty much exhausted and once again pretty spread thin. This is mostly due to the redemption crusades after the Age of Apostasy. And it was at this time that system after system just started to fall to the Orcs and Chaos incursions.
Oh yes.
Leading the Imperistorum to turn over lots of systems and worlds to the direct control of more Space Marine chapters. This is kind of the time when, when we talk about Space Marine chapters nowadays, when we get into our home lore for our own chapters and all of that, we'll talk about like Fortress Monastery worlds and stuff like that. Before this era, chapters didn't do that. Chapters weren't really given a world. The legions all had home worlds, but the chapters weren't necessarily given a planet. This is that the M38 era is when a lot of that started to happen.
And they settled down.
Yeah. Had some kids.
Colonizing.
Put down some roots.
So, having purged more than 400 worlds within the Eye of Terra, the survivors of the Abyssal Crusade were like, "Hey, bitches, we back!" However, they came back without ceremony. They didn't want any honors, and they didn't really announce themselves. And without pausing, the chapter master, Convac Lon of the Vorpal Swords, just declared a saint, Saint Basilius, a false idol. And in less than a standard year, every known sepulchre and shrine dedicated to the shrine dedicated to the false saint had been destroyed. The saint was also executed. His bones, along with most of his relics, all of the books they could find, and thousands of pieces of doctrine, along with hundreds of thousands of his living worshippers, were all placed into derelict bulk hold freighters and launched directly into the nearest sun.
That's what's up.
Yep. Yeah, we're done with you.
Hey guys, we're
That's
home.
what's up.
Oh, you want us to
Wait.
leave again?
Wait, what?
Okay.
There was also an event called the Grim Harvest, which happened kind of in the mid-range of M38, and this is when a great armada of misshapen space hulks drifted out of the warp near Terra. Some of these twisted and fused starships could still be identified as the transports that were carrying the pilgrims from the Lost Crusade we mentioned earlier. The Inquisition is basically still working feverishly to cover up this fleet's existence and make sure that the cargo of mutant and demon-possessed aberrations that came out with it never touched the Imperial citizens. So that basically wraps up everything to where we're going to pick up with talking about the lore of the 41st millennium. I know we're ending kind of towards the middle or the end of M38, but everything we're going to go from forward is pretty much going to be stuff that happened in M40 and M41. That will be part 2. You guys have any final thoughts on this kind of expansive lore dump here?
Mostly just because I don't remember the exact time and dates of each one, but by M41, are all the Primarchs pretty much gone? Or did that the whole thing with Dorn going missing in the big fleet explosion, and then Gilman getting stabbed?
Yeah, we didn't touch a lot on that stuff. There's the War and the Beast. There's a lot of stuff that we're going to dive into specifically later. But yeah, at this point, Primarchs really aren't on the scene anymore.
Right. They've all. We didn't specifically touch on each one's disappearing act, but by this point,
they're all gone.
And that's very easy lore for people to pick up should they want to.
Oh yeah, because each Primarch's got a huge story, so we don't want to have to go over all of the in-depth
we'll get
stuff,
into the dibble dabble of all that.
By this point, they're all gone.
Yep.
And all the traitor Primarchs or demon Primarchs have kind of awayed themselves.
The weird thing with the demon Primarchs is the demon Primarchs kind of show up whenever the hell they want to.
Yeah, they kind of move in and out of existence.
The demon Primarchs can be like sent back completely to the warp, but they can't really ever be killed.
Right.
So Angron, Fulgrim, and Mortarion are the demon Primarchs we know, and Magnus, are the demon Primarchs that we know of in existence now in the game. And they all kind of swoop in and out of everything.
Yeah.
The one thing I was going to touch up on is just the term Space Hulk for people who don't know.
Oh yeah.
Space
Hulks are cool.
We just glanced off that real quick.
Space Hulks are basically, if you imagine how we were talking about ships traveling through the warp, sometimes they get lost. And when they're lost, if you can imagine kind of like if you've ever thrown a bunch of like stuff into the washing machine, like your laundry, and then all of a sudden
it all gets wrapped up in the fitted sheet.
Exactly, right? And then you pull out this like fur ball of like net and lint and all this stuff. It's kind of
coins in there.
Yeah, like it's all
lighter. And
so that's basically what happens to these ships when they go through the warp and they get lost. They're in a way merged together multi-dimensionally until when they come out of the warp, they're just this ball of ship and wobble passageways.
Event
And,
Horizon.
It's
Yeah,
like
it's
a
that,
hairball.
it's
Yeah.
The warp coughs it up like a hairball, and it's
Yeah.
just gross.
That's
Yeah.
that's that whole thing. Han Solo tells Luke Skywalker, like, hey, hyperspace travel isn't crop dusting, kid. Skip too close to a planet, you might come out in the middle of a sun. The difference is when two derelict war machines in the warp come across each other or both skip into real space at the same time, they don't explode, they merge.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Space Hulks are pretty cool. I definitely have Space Hulk lore in some of my personal lore stuff, so I'm sure we'll talk about them.
I mean, there's a whole game about it. There's enough lore to make a whole game.
Cool. Space Hulks are so fucking cool. All right, guys. Well, we hope you enjoyed that episode. You definitely gained a little bit more insight into what the world of Warhammer 40k is. Kind of sets up a lot of the beat steps for the factions we're going to talk about going forward and kind of the events that we're going to talk about in part 2. We'll definitely get back to picking out our favorite little parts of lore, talking about our own army lore, as well as our continuing narratives. Specifically, one of our campaigns, the Hexus campaign, which I'm sure you guys will hear about in the future, definitely deals with some warp fuckery and warp storms. Also,
I can't wait till we get that rolling.
My home lore, which deals with a group of planets called a group of systems called the Squadron systems, also deals with the warp storm. So it's definitely some cool stuff that we'll definitely play with as we move forward into future casts.
My Byzantine, sector Byzantine.
Yeah, we got some cool stuff. But yeah, we didn't get to it, but we're gonna try to touch on some of our work in progress stuff and just some of our thoughts on new releases and all of that, of course. And we'll definitely start sharing a little bit more about our Friday night games. But please feel free to reach out to us on email. You can get to us at underthehiveofmadness@gmail.com or jimdarkgaming@gmail.com. Again, Jim Dark Gaming is GYMDARKGAMING @gmail.com. Under the Hive of Madness is pretty easy to spell. That's the name of the podcast. You can find us on Instagram at Jim Dark Gaming. You can also find our Facebook group under Jim Dark Gaming, and you can follow us on Twitter. We are diligently working on getting our Patreon up and running, so hopefully we'll have some announcements about that soon. But if you want to get in contact with us like today, we got a Discord, so hit that up. That's also Jim Dark Gaming.
Yeah, we're actually all pretty active on there too.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, bunch of messages every day.
Yeah, please join that. That would be the best way to get.
Yeah, chit chat.
Cool.
100%.
I'd
probably
love to
be
talk more.
Yeah, that'd be the best way to kind of tell us, like, oh, hey, I want to hear about this.
Yeah.
Hell yeah. So without further ceremony, I just want to wish everybody a good forearmed emperor.
A what?
A forearmed emperor.
Ford Emperor? Yeah.
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 That's what I said.
Sounds like heresy to
Oh
me.
shit, dude. You
Is
have to-
is Horus still War Master?
Don't you go and anger their machine spirit.
All right, guys. We'll hit you up in episode 5, part 2 of a brief history of freaking everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, dear God.
Brief.
Brief. All right, guys. We'll talk to you soon.